Gerai, tai labas vakaras visiems, sakau, dėl filmavimo mes turbūt pradėsim nuo šitos vietos. Ir man labai malonu pristatyti savo gerą draugą iš Niujorko ir anksčiau iš Bostono, taip pat mokslininkę Jurgitą Verbickienę, kurie šiandien mūsų yra pagrindiniai pranešėjai. Ir aš dėl to neišsiplėsiu daug pasakojimų. Jie patys viską pasakys, ką reikia pasakyti, galbūt aš įsiterpsiu su kažkokius klausimus. Tai turbūt Elliotas pirmas, šiek tiek kaip kalbėjau, tai tada jūs ir tada vėl grįžim prie Ellioto. So as we decided, you do now the main introduction, then and stop at the place where it is good for you to interfere with the academic relations, the purpose, the possibilities provided by your project to do multi-scientific research and cooperate for different universities of the world in the framework of this project. Taigi, Elliotas, kilęs iš Rumšiškių, tiksliau jo šaknys Rumšiškėse, ir dėl to jisai kalba apie savo projektą susijusį su Rumšiškėm, The Floor is Yours.
Thank you, Žilvinas, and thank you. And I like the fact that it's intimate, so I'm not so nervous. But because there's so few people here, if you have questions, stop me, and I'd like this informal kind of presentation. So, my name is Elliot Matz. I am originally from Massachusetts, near Boston in the US. And I'm going to start with telling a story, how this all came about. So, my father was, he grew up also in Boston, and he was interested in his father's family's history, so my grandfather's family's history. And I worked with my father on gathering information about the family, mainly by interviewing older family members who remembered what we called the old country, which was Lithuania. And in our case, that harked back to a village in Lithuania, similar to many Ashkenazi Jews. So that's my grandfather on the left. He and two brothers and a sister left Lithuania in about 1895. He was probably 19 or 20 years old, I don't know exactly. I believe this photo was taken in a studio in Kaunas, but they grew up and lived in Rumšiškių or Rumšiškių. I remember hearing the name Rumšiškių when I was a kid. In 1968, when I was 13, we interviewed a man in Brookline who was a relative, Brookline, Massachusetts, who had an amazing memory of people, dates, places, and anecdotes. And I wrote it all down. I was a budding architect at the time. I thought I wanted to be an architect. So I took down all the information and put it on a chart, what we might call now a family tree chart. And it included a lot of basic information back then, maybe 100 names. And he told stories about people But all I really knew about the town at the time was that its name was Rumšiškių. And I looked it up in a book and found out that its Lithuanian name was Rumšiškis. I don't have very many photos of people, but I do have this other one. This is my great-grandfather and his wife, and a grandchild that he brought up. And I believe this was also taken in a studio in Kaunas. I don't know anything about the studio, but I imagine some people do. So fast forward 20 years to 1988. In 1988, I was working in New York. I had graduated from college and grad school, and I was working at a bank. And a colleague of mine at the bank went on a Baltic cruise with his partner. And when he came back to the office, he knew that I was interested in Lithuania and genealogy. When he came back to the office, he brought with him a tour book that the ship company had given them, a list of tours that they could take when the ship docked in each port. And I was looking through the book, and I saw that when the boat docked in Klaipėda, there was a day tour to Rumšiškis. And I couldn't understand. This was 1988. Lithuania was still controlled by the Soviets. I knew something about this. I had studied Russian in high school. And I knew that the small towns were all closed to tourists. And even in the major cities, you had to have an in-tourist guide with you all the time. So I couldn't understand why my grandfather's town was open to tourism. I do remember that my father had told me that the town was on the Neman River, or I guess you'd call it the Nemunas River. And he told me that a lot of the people in the town, at least the Jewish people, were in the lumber or timber industry, chopping down trees and floating the wood down to Kaunas to be milled. But that's really all I knew. So I figured out that the Soviets had built a dam, that the dam had a hydroelectric dam, that it had formed this was just outside of Kaunas, it had formed a lake, and the lake had flooded a number of villages and towns, including Rumšiškių. My understanding is Rumšiškių was like the largest of the towns that was flooded. And that the Soviets had built a new town of Rumšiškių, or Rumšiškis, nearby. Shortly thereafter, this was probably 1962 or something like that, the Lithuanians decided to build an open-air museum to show what life was like in pre-World War I Lithuania. And I'm imagining that they chose Rumšiškis, number one, because it was strategically located between the two largest cities of Kaunas and Vilnius, but also because there was so much upheaval going on in that area that it probably allowed for them to take some land and build this museum there. So the town, of course my grandfather's town was submerged, but it allowed for them to build this open-air museum. And when I discovered that my grandfather's town seemed like it was the only town in Eastern Europe open for tourism, I said to myself, how could I not go to visit that town? And I made a deal with my mother. My father had passed away long before. I couldn't talk any friends to go with me to Russia and Lithuania at the time. So I made a deal with my mother. My mother was a widow, but she loved to travel. You met my mother at the very end of her life in Boston. We made the deal that she would come with me to Russia and Lithuania, if then I would go with her somewhere she wanted to go. And we made that deal. She came with me to Russia and Lithuania, and then later I went with her to Ireland.
What year was?
This was 1988.
Okay, thank you.
And she grew up in an Irish neighborhood, a Jewish and Irish neighborhood in Boston, but she loved Irish literature and Irish history, and so she had always wanted to go to Ireland. Okay, so we made that deal. So we came here in 1988. My mother was very nervous because we didn't know whether or not to tell anybody that we were Jewish, and how that would be received. When we came to Vilnius and then to Kaunas, we arranged for a driver and in-tourist guide to take us, there's a band playing. She arranged for them to take us to Rumšiškių and to take us to the museum, but also we asked the in-tourist guide if she would take us into the town of Rumšiškių to see if we could find someone old enough to remember before the war and maybe remember our family, the Matz family. Is that a parade on the street?
Might be. Very planned.
I like it. So that's me in 1988, and that is our in-tourist guide, who was wonderful. She was a Lithuanian woman. She had no love lost for the Russians and the Soviets, and she told us, anything you want to do, we will do. And we told her that we were Jewish, and that my grandfather had come from this town, and she offered to help translate and see if we could find someone to remember before the war. We looked at the museum, which was very beautiful and sophisticated. It was, at that time, the museum was really only showing life in rural Lithuania, life on the farms. And there was no mention of Jews, even though, of course, Jews were, there were 200,000 Jews before the war, but before World War I. But the Jews, that probably was not inaccurate that the museum didn't mention Jews, because Jews were primarily merchants and tradespeople. They weren't farmers. As a matter of fact, there was a period of time when Jews were prohibited from owning land and being farmers. So we found the church caretaker. The original church of Rumšiškių was actually moved before the town was flooded, and we were told that it was one of the only buildings that survived the flooding. And our interpreter helped us interview this woman, and she was wonderful. And actually, I've been back to Rumšiškių later and showed this photo, and people remember this woman with very fondly. She remembered before the war. She was a teenager during the war. She remembered the Jewish community. She said she thought that she remembered that her parents had worked for Jews. She remembered the day that the Germans invaded. She remembered the day that the Jews were were rounded up, and I think they were made to stay in the synagogue for one night, and then they were marched out to the outskirts of the town, and they were murdered, and she knew where the murder site was. And she told us. She did not remember our family name, but, you know, what are you going to do? We did go to the killing site after that day, and I looked out over the lake and then said Kaddish, which is the Jewish prayer for the dead. And that is a photo that I took on the top of the killing site in 1988. And of course, this is the site. I took this photo in 2017 or 2019, but the same place. Fast forward another 30 years. I had put our family tree onto family tree software called Family Tree Maker, which is really the standard at this point for family tree software. And I posted it online, and I got a lot of people who inquired as to whether we were related or not. And at that point, there were like 500 names on the family tree. As a matter of fact, in 2019, we took the family tree and laid it out on the ground on the walkway in Kaunas. That is our family tree. That's me over there in the blue shirt. But you can see that it was pretty extensive, and people were stopping on me as they walked by and asking, what the hell is that? So in 2017, I was hanging out with a friend of mine from high school in Belmont, Massachusetts. And I thought that he was Irish, but it turns out that he was half Irish, half Lithuanian. And I said to my friend Ed, I said, I wish there was like one town in the world that somehow had escaped modernization where I could go and see how my ancestors lived day to day. And he said, and he was half Lithuanian, not Jewish, and he said, oh my God, I want to go to that same town because my ancestors were your ancestors' neighbors. And we started looking around to see if there was any place we could go to see what life was like for both of our ancestors. And there's no open-air museum that shows the gestalt of a market town. We realized at the time that there are millions of Jews in diaspora and millions of non-Jews, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Polish people from market towns in Eastern Europe, and there's nowhere that any of them can go to see the fullness of life in those market towns. And it's then that I decided to come back to Rumšiškių and see what had happened at the open air museum. So I came back to Lithuania in the summer of 2017, and my friend Merit here was with me, and some other some other people, relatives of mine, and people who also had relatives from Rumšiškių. I was introduced to Žilvinas at that time, and Žilvinas met us and helped us do a tour of Lithuania and brought us to the museum. And of course, you know that Žilvinas has spent his career studying and promoting the history and culture of Jews in Lithuania, and we became fast friends, and I'm very indebted to him for helping put this whole project together. So, as I mentioned, when I visited the museum in 1988, there was just the exhibit about farm life. When I came back in 2017, there were, with other people whose ancestors came from the town, we went back to the museum, and the museum now had, in addition to the farm life exhibits, had a recreation of a market town. And we went to visit it. But it still has almost no representation of Jews in market towns. And that was not accurate, because I knew that, number one, the town of Rumšiškių itself had been 40% Jewish before the war, and all the market towns in Eastern Europe were anywhere from 20 to 70%, or something around there, Jews. So to have a market town, and the market town square itself would have been more like 90% Jews, because the Jews typically owned the stores and the shops and the bars, and they would own the shops and live behind them or above them or something like that. So I'm back here in 2017, and I'm thinking to myself, this is not correct. And Lithuania sends every school kid to this museum to learn about Lithuanian history. I thought to myself, I have to somehow make the story that they're telling accurate. So I have put together an effort to correct the story that is being told. And that effort is, I'm going to tell you about this strategy to try to change this. I have thought with a group of other people that there should be at least one place in the world where one can go and see accurately how all of our ancestors, Christians and Jews, lived together, the good and the bad, and it was not always pretty, how they struggled and how they cooperated. And more than that, we should be able to learn lessons from the hundreds of years of these diverse cultural groups living together, and perhaps apply those lessons to today's world. So I'm going to ask Jurgita to say a few words in a few moments, but I am proposing to build, with the help of a lot of other people, a new complementary nearby museum to the existing museum that will show, like Colonial Williamsburg in the US, Sturbridge Village in the US, Skansen in Sweden, will show how people lived in Eastern European market towns. And if done well, which I hope it will be, it could be the destination for the millions of people worldwide who want to understand how people really lived in market towns. But in addition to that, we want to have there to be an academic research entity that will research how Christians and Jews lived in these market towns through 6 centuries. To that end, we've established a collaboration between Vilnius University and Yeshiva University in New York to academically study how people lived. And that has started, and I have already set up a not-for-profit corporation. I'm going to bring you in a moment. I've set up a not-for-profit corporation in New York State to try to raise money to build a state-of-the-art open-air museum nearby the existing museum that'll operate in conjunction with the existing museum. And people will go to the existing museum to see what life was like on the farms, but they'll go to the new museum the same day to see what life was like in market towns. But in addition to that, there will be some kind of additional exhibition about the history of Christians and Jews living together. Žilvinas introduced me to Jurgita. Žilvinas is on my board, Jurgita is on my board. We have a number of other eminent people. Merit is on my board. But we have the head curator at Colonial Williamsburg, which is the United States' premier open-air museum, on the board. We've consulted with EXARC, which is the international organization of open-air museums. We've gotten the local, actually the Ministry of Culture of Lithuania is on board helping us. The existing museum and its administration is helping us. The U.S. Embassy in Vilnius has been very helpful. The Israeli Embassy. The County of Kaiserslautern is on board and helping us. The community organization of the town of Rumšiškių has been wonderful, and many others. I'll talk more about a couple of other efforts that have gone on after we've spoken with Jurgita, but Jurgita is working with Shai Pilnik at Yeshiva University to spearhead this academic effort, and maybe you want to talk about it?
Thank you, Elliot, for the introduction and really for a brilliant personal story and research story. I would like just to tell that you make the first steps the same or usually like the scholars do. So go to place to try to find the people that remember something, to try and make the oral story and to try to deconstruct what these people say. But now really we decided to cooperate with Elliot and Elliot team. We understood that it's really very necessary, it's really very important to make a separate research. To understood what really happened, and probably some of you will have a question why it's not shtetl but market town, why we use another definition, and with another definition, not shtetl but especially the market town, comes from the understanding that market town includes the shtetl, and market towns covered all possible lifestyles of everyday life in the town. So it's market towns, it's the most usual form in Lithuania. So we have some towns, so it's, if I look in the past, I cannot tell that Vilnius was city, so okay, let it will be town as well. So, and then the big number, huge number of small towns, that's what was most usual form of living place for the local inhabitants. It is true that the Jews in some places was a quite big part of the inhabitants, but not in the all. So we have some specific mistakes that comes from the historiography and from the nostalgia as well when the people discover the shtetl. So it comes as well from the USA, from America, when the people started to write the diaries and memories about former life in the World Twin. And it was a lot of love to these places. It was a lot of nostalgia about the former days when the people was young. And usually the people of the Jewish origin explain the lifestyle in the Jewish community. But very rarely mention the people outside the Jewish community. So, but it's not mean that it was no contact. It was no contact because the Christian community, it was Ukrainian community, or Poles, Belarusian community was necessary to the Jews, and Jews was necessary to the other people. So it was, this coexistence was a fact of Ukrainian history. And what we tried to do, so we tried to reconstruct how the people live in the everyday life basis. So how it look like Monday in the town place, how it look like, I don't know, Sunday, Friday or something like that, how it look Monday during the spring and how it's a Monday during the winter and something like that. So the main idea is to make such a research that it covers different kinds of behaviors of local inhabitants, that is cover micro-history approach if we look in the terms of the academia. And then it's mostly everyday life history, that is as well small scale research. Even we talk about the Rumšiškės as a place, mostly we think about the general market town. So it's, as Elliot mentioned, that it will be small part exhibition of Rumšiškės itself, on Rumšiškė Jewish community, and we will do only part of research about the Rumšiškės life, but mostly it will be reconstructed, I don't know how to tell, unique or generalized view of marketplace. And what we will do, what we do now, so it's the first step is to somehow encourage the academic research to try to find materials, to go to archives, to talk with the people, to read the interval press and so on. So just to try to understand what happened, what conflicts, falling in love, I don't know, some friendships and so on, was actual in different times. Chronologically, we cover a period, I assume from the source it will be a little bit easier, from the beginning of the 19th century, but probably we cover a little bit earlier period as introduction to such kind of lifestyle, and then it's till the Holocaust. And I assume that we a little bit cover, and still very interesting point that Elliot not mentioned. Rumšiškės is probably only one, not only one found in the Europe from there the Elliot family comes, but as well probably only one town under the water. So that is really very, very interesting. We talk about the town under the water, and it's possible to find the place of Jewish cemetery. It's possible to find places of former shtetl and so on. So it could be really very interesting project to understand how the underwater Rumšiškės looks like, and to explain this very specific story that shows the Soviet attitude to the people life, the Soviet attitude to the market town situation. So what we create an academic board from several people, and mostly what we have here really very well in that we began cooperation between the Vilniaus University and Yeshiva University in New York. And even today before our meeting, I have the conversation via Zoom with Shai. We work quite intensively, and as well we try to create the courses, teaching courses to the students from both universities in the same time. And it was, I don't have exact information right now, but it was announced or not, the competition for the students?
It was.
It was, yeah. And it will be surprised to Elliot because today I received a letter from one student from Yeshiva University, yeah. And she asked and wrote several questions. She is somehow connected to Belarus, so it's maybe relatives are from Belarus, but she studied at Yeshiva University. So she asked how it's possible to connect and what the main research questions there are. So I do not answer still now, but such letter we have. And we have idea and we have a small scholarships with founding for the students from the Yeshiva University and from the Vilniaus University to begin the cooperation, to begin exchange and to begin the research project. And this competition is really very open. It is announced and what we're expecting that the students come with very different backgrounds. It's not only history, but it could be museology, educology, didactic, Holocaust presentation, or sociology, economics, and so on. So it's no any limits for the students' background, but the main thing is the creativity of the students, the idea how it's possible and how it could be presented, the market town idea. And how this market town idea is important for us, it is one of the main questions, because we would like not only to make academic research, we would like not only to create museum and exhibition, but in the same time we would like to make educational area, educational rooms, and to have some lessons from the past, to have some lessons not about the conflicting past, but about the resolution of the conflicts, about living together after the conflicts. That is really very important in the understanding of Lithuanian and Jewish history, or Jewish and Lithuanian history. So if somebody have any ideas, have any information, I don't know some people who are involved in the research, interesting of Rumšiškės history or history of Lithuanian market towns in different aspects as well, as we told, it's economic as well, it's social behavior, everyday life, so it's tradition, and so on. Please contact us, and it will be really very, very big help for us.
She said it. I mean, my father, who started me in this whole effort when I was a kid, I haven't discussed this with you guys, but my father served in the American Air Force in World War II, was stationed in North Africa and in Bahrain, and when he came back after the war, they brought him home through Europe, and Italy and Germany, and the destruction and the horror that he saw after the war affected him for the rest of his life. And he had not been a religious person before that, but he became religious, more religious afterward. But he also became a pacifist and demonstrated against the Vietnam War in the United States and everything. And it's really this effort to learn lessons from the history of his town, or all the market towns, that could somehow help us resolve conflicts non-violently, is really what he lived for, and I'm, in a way, doing this for him. Just to finish up, the effort to build the museum is proceeding, and I have a lot, as I said, a lot of people cooperating with us. but we're trying to do this with private funding, and this is not the greatest time to be fundraising. Our capital budget is on the order of $16 million, and that's not little.
I thought it was 25.
Well, when did you hear that? It's coming down. But between the pandemic and Ukraine and stuff, it's difficult. But we're working to raise money, and maybe we'll start in smaller steps. But the effort is going forward to be able to, in addition to the research, be able to build a museum that will be a destination for people who want to learn about everyday life in market towns, Christians and Jews, and the history of their relationships. I also should mention that, I don't know if any of you ever heard the name Dr. Richard Freund, who actually recently passed away, but he was a non-invasive archaeologist. He used high-tech methods to look under the ground to see what was there without disturbing the ground. And he's done a lot of such archaeology in Lithuania, including at the Great Synagogue in Vilnius.
And presenting his technique and his research here in Latvia.
Yes, he
A
did.
couple of times.
He helped put together the information that made the movie The Good Nazi, about what was his name?
Carl Blake or something.
Carl Plagg.
Carl.
Yes. He also did research at Ponar.
About the escape tunnel.
The escape from what was it called?
From a pit.
Yeah, but the name of the documentary is Escape from Ponar, was it? I don't know.
Escape tunnel.
It's the escape tunnel, thank you,
Escape
yes.
tunnel.
Yes.
It's a whole thing?
Sorry?
Escape tunnel. Tunnel.
Escape tunnel.
Tunnel. Okay.
And those, The Good Nazi, the escape tunnel are available to see online. He also was intrigued by the idea that when he heard about Rumšiškių and that my grandfather came from there and that the town is underwater, he wanted to experiment with his high-tech archaeology under the water. And he came here in 2019. I was here. My nephew, who is a diver, came along. And they filmed and then produced a documentary called Stories from the Depths of the Lagoon, which really tells the story of three people who's had connections to the town of Rumšiškių underwater, myself and two other people who remember the town. And they made that documentary, and it's actually, I think, a pretty powerful documentary about Rumšiškių, but about connections to history. Let me see if I've forgotten anything. That's where Rumšiškių is, and you can see the body of water there, which is the Kaunas Lagoon that was formed when the Neman River was dammed for the hydroelectric plant. This is actually a map of Rumšiškių, and this was given to us by the county, and once we've raised the money, they will help us find a piece of land to buy near the existing museum on which to build our new museum. This is actually a photograph pre-war of Rumšiškių, the market town square, 1930. This was Coronation Day, which was celebrated at that time. But there are very few actual documents that I've been able to find that show the original town of Rumšiškių. This is a typical market town square, not Rumšiškių. This shows the town of Rumšiškių before the dam was built, and the blue line shows the outline of where what the lagoon covers now. This is an aerial photo that was taken by a Nazi Air Force person in 1944, and that is the town of Rumšiškių before it was flooded. One last comment. So one of the marketing lines that I use for this project is, there are now many worthy places to visit in Eastern Europe to see how people died, but there's nowhere to go to see how they lived. And that's what this project is trying to resolve. And I also wanted to mention, there's some other, Žilvinas has brought me and Merit and some other people to some other projects, like the Loschstädel project in Šedeva, which is going to be an amazing place. But our museum is different from all those other projects. There's the Poland Museum, which we just visited in Warsaw, which beautifully shows the history of Jews in Poland. The difference between two differences between the Loschstädel Museum and ours is that the Loschstädel Museum is only going to be concentrating on the Jewish part of the town, and as sophisticated as it's going to be, it will not be an open-air museum. It will be a behind-the-glass museum. Very sophisticated, very state-of-the-art, but not one where you be able to immerse yourself in activities that were taking place before that. The Poland Museum also is beautiful, but there's no open-air aspect to it. So this will be the only open-air museum that shows market town life anywhere. Thank you. Yes, please.
Something else and then ask you to expand a little bit more. Aš tik pridėsiu. Klausimams paskui pabaiga. I'd like to add also that Ilija girdi, kad aš norėčiau pridėti dar truputį prie to, ką jis pasakė.
You can say, won't insult me if you want to speak in Lithuanian.
But I just wanted to add that the visit and of Elliot's visits to Rumšiškių and his participation and getting acquainted with the local community stirred up the memory and realization of the younger generation that this Jewish community did exist and the history belongs to them, and they started caring about it. And now I'll turn to Lithuanian and we'll say about that commemoration, which was the day before yesterday. Jo lankymasis Rumšiškėse ir dalyvavimas sujudino atmintį tų žmonių, jie suprato, jie susimastė, nes tiesiog jau buvo įprasta, jaunesni žmonės gyvena savo gyvena. Ir staiga tas Ellioto pasirodymas, bet ypatingai prieš porą dienų jisai pasiūlė, suorganizavo ir mielai malonu, kad tiek Liaudies buities muziejus, tiek vietinė bendruomenė, mokykla ir aktyvistai labai šiltai priėmė ir atsišaukė. Pirmą kartą Rumšiškėse buvo paminėtos tos masinės žudynės, kurios įvyko. Lietuvoje jos vyko nuo Liepos 41 metais, nuo Liepos pabaigos per visą Rugpjūčio. Ir Rumšiškėse tai atsitiko 29 rugpjūčio. Tai ir niekada nebuvo paminėta. Kaip matėte, anksčiau, kai jis nebuvo nei akmens, dabar yra akmuo, kartais gidai užveda ten turistus. Ir dabar muziejus paruošė vietą, nes tai muziejus teritorija yra ta žudynių vieta. Pastatė suoliukus, nukirto krūmus, įrengė aplinką, pakvietė vaikus, vietinius muzikantus, aktyvistus. Ir Elliotas pasakojo apie savo šeimą, pagrojo tokia muzikos truputėlį buvo vietinė smuikininkė. Ir vaikai labai gražiai pirmą kartą paskaitė žuvusių vardus. Buvo tokia, Elliotas paskatino tokią apeigą iš žydiškų laidotuvių, kai kūnas nuleidžiamas į žemę, mes paimam saują ir metam smėlio ar žemę ant karsto, tai ten su kastuvu truputėlį užkabina ir taip pat metam karsto. Visi sako, šitie žmonės neturėjo progos gauti šitą paslaugą ir pirmas pakabino truputėlį žemės ir metė ant akmens. Ir paskui mes visi įsijungėm ir visi po truputėlį pirmą kartą jiems padarėm tokį laidojimo ritualą, pavėluotą laidojimo ritualą. Buvo Kaišiadorių meras, mokytojai, muziejaus direktorė ir viskas buvo labai taip šilta, jauku, intymu. Ir aš paskui girdėjau, kaip tie žmonės kalbėjosi, kad reikia ir kitais metais mes čia suorganizuosim, mes čia padarysim. Matosi, kad jie parideno tokį akmenį, tokią tradiciją įveda ir tai praturtino tą bendruomenę su atmintimi ir žinomumu. Ir tai yra ir pagarba tiem žuvusiam, ir praturtinimu sovietiniu gyvenimu. Taip pat jisai paminėjo, kad valdyboje yra Williamsburg Colonial muziejus. Ir aš siūlyčiau paguglinti ir pažiūrėti, kaip atrodo tas muziejus. Iš tiesų, kas įdomu, what is interesting, when we were driving to the commemoration you inspired, I started driving, and on radio there was a feature going on, interview with those people who worked for the last statue. And it lasted until the very end when we had to start it. And I'm about to come back and to listen to those people I know and who worked for the last statue. And they were telling all the details. And I was trying to understand what symbolic is in between those facts that we are going to the commemoration and the speaking our last statue. But I managed to pick up some information and to compare and to think about the differences of the concept of those two museums. So, jeigu jūs pažiūrėte Williamsburg Colonial, ir ten dirba, aš vieną pažįstu tą, kuris yra valdyba, toks Peter Inker. Na, tiesiog aš Lietuvoje nesutikau tokio lygio muziejininkų ir tokio supratimo, filosofinio tokio supratimo apie tai, kaip perdodama atmintis. Mes įpratom, kad muziejai yra akmenys, strėlės, ietis, kardai, guli kažkokie ir guli. Fantazuot, labai įdomu, gali fantazuot. Bet ten Vilniaus kolonija, ten 17 ar 18 amžiaus miestelis, važinėja karietos, žmonės vaikšto apsirengę tais drabužiais, kvepia tais kvapais, gamina tuos pačius valgius, eina, kvapai iš tenais. Kalba tuo akcentu to laikotarpio, kai kalbėjau. Kaip tu gali pasinerti į tą aplinką, tiesiog ją pačiupinėti. Labai fainai ir gražu yra tos naujos multimedija, technologijos ir taip toliau, žinoma, jos labai daug duoda. Polin muziejus duoda labai daug informacijos. Bet visą tai kažkokiam tai tokiam steriliam, skaitmeniniam, digitaliniam tokiam išeina lygiai. Ir tas, vis tiek jisai neatneša iki smegenų neuronų to pojūčio, to, žinai, to kontakto, to ryšio. Tu vėlgi gali fantazuoti, tu žinai, tarkim, objektyvius faktus apie žudynės, tu gali koncentracijos stovyklos irgi muziejai, daug labai lavonų, Aušvice batukų, plaukų, tai labai impresyvu. Irgi. Bet šiuo atveju originalumas yra tas, kad numatoma, kad tai priešingai negu Losštetel, tai kaip ten lietuviškai vadinasi?
Miestelis.
Dingeštetas. Tai reiškia, vis tiek daug kas bus ten be tos pačiupinėjimo, ne tokie, bet nebus arba strėlės antgalio įsivaizduoju, bus daug multimedijos, kažkas bus atvežta, kažkas nupirkta. Ir kaip spėjau per tą laidą išgirsti, baigsis viskas kapinėm. Ir atseit tokiu atviru klausimu, kad, kapinės, viskas mylia. Gerai, mes taip turim tą žinoti, pagarbą atiduoti. O šiuo atveju gyvenimas. Ir, kaip sakė, interakcija. Ir ne tik žydiškas, bet jisai bendras miestelio centre. Tai išlieka pakankamai daug originalumo tai koncepcijai ir man atrodo, kad tikrai būtų labai vertingas dalykas tokį turėti. Ir kiek kalbėjau, tiek fantazavimas, tarkim, ne iš karto, ne kiekvieną dieną gali tie matininkai pradėti dirbti ir tais kvapais kvepėti ir ten vaikščioti ir bendrauti, žinai. Bet po truputėlį per kažkokias šventes, festivalius tai gali įsijungti ir tikrai gali būti atraktyvu. So, yeah, you understood everything.
I got the gist of it.
I'll tell you. So, my suggestion was to Google Williamsburg Colonial and about the differences of the concept of the Losštetel and this museum. It's a living museum, it doesn't end with the Holocaust, doesn't end with the cemetery, it shows real interaction, and is, as I see at least personally, as a very big advantage of that it's not digital, it's not in multimedia, which might be very objective and very rich, but at the same time it remains sterile, it remains with no smell, with no touch, with no real sound. I don't know whether you're going to have fleas and dogs running around, but still that would also could be included. Aš sakau, kad galbūt ir reikėtų, kad blusų šunys turėtų
horses and cows.
Arkliai su savo ką pakrauna ir karvės ir taip toliau. So yeah, that I was speaking that Peter Rinke, to my mind, is also a treasure because he knows on the very top level how this memory is preserved and especially it's important how it's conveyed, how it's given to those who actually never ever dreamt about that. So, and memory is one of the most mysterious and interesting things, and for having and building up our better identities, my belief. So, sorry for that long interference. Please go on and say maybe more some details about the project, because you had always updated new versions coming on with pictures and maybe you have something to add. I believe you've got something to add, and also I believe you will show that piece of movie.
The 6-minute thing?
Yeah.
I could, if you want, if there was a way of hooking up my computer to your...
No, you can give a link and we will, it's online, the computer.
Yeah, I know, but we tried to do it before and your Wi-Fi connection wasn't so great. But I have it, it's on my computer, so I could...
Yeah, but it will take time. Usually, it has to work.
Well, so
Then-
if,
Okay, I will check the internet
Yeah,
connection.
check the internet and it,
well, I can give you the link if, yeah,
Yeah, you just forward the link and it should work.
if
We
everybody
did
wants
it many times.
to stay here.
Trumpas būtų filmukas apie šitą. Maybe before the technical things are as a result, there were questions.
Yes.
Aš trumpą įžangą pasakysiu. 70 metais, 72 metais aš buvau moksleivė ir mes su tėvu važiuodavom į tą vietą žvejoti.
į Rumšiškas.
Bet jau tos vietos nebuvo, mes pravažiuodavom jau naujus pastatus po vandeniu po šitą. Ir važiuodavom pas lietuvius, kurie biškai toliau važiavo. Ir aš labai tėvo norėjau, nežinau kodėl, aš dar buvau nepilnametė, labai norėjau nustatyti tą vietą, kur buvo ta vieta, kur gyveno.
Rumšiškių.
Jo, kur jis pasakojo, kad ta vieta po vandeniu. Ir žiemos buvo labai šaltos tada, netoli kranto tėvas žvejodavo, aš galvoju, kad aš per ledą pamatysiu. Dugnas matos. Paskui tėvą paprašiau, ėjom labai toli, užšalo kalno marius, ėjom per ledą. Ledas buvo toks, tėvas darydavo šitus. Ir aš galvoju, kad ten ką nors vyko. Ir paskui tėvas paprašė žvejų vasarą, ir žvejys su dideliu laivu, metaliniu tokiu, su katamaranu, nuplaukė mane, vat kur tą vietą po vandeniu. Ir man jo klausimas, ar jis buvo su valtim nuplaukęs, vat į tą maždaug vietą, kur buvo tas kaimas.
Tatiana used to go with her father in 1972 to go fishing there, and she was always interested in Rumšiškės, in that place which is now under the water. And she was trying to somehow to see through the water and then through the ice, and never succeeded actually. But she was shown later by locals the exact place. And the question is whether you have a right to travel there above the location on boat. I know that Richard did with
Yes.
sledges.
Yes, I did go on the boat, but they went under the water with high-tech equipment and actually tried to find evidence of the town. Dr. Freund thought that he would see foundations of buildings and things. Unfortunately, they didn't find that much stuff, but my nephew, if you watch that documentary, my nephew felt with his feet. It was very, you can't see anything, it's all very dark and murky, but he felt with his feet remains of foundations and things. And then when he went to where the cemetery was, he he felt with his feet some gravestones, and he brought back a piece of a stone. That's also in the documentary. But Dr. Freund, unfortunately, did not find, even with his high-tech equipment, he couldn't find a lot of like real scientific evidence of the remains of the town. I was also told that most of there were a couple of people who physically moved their houses away from the water, and you'll see in the documentary a couple of examples of that. But I was told that the Soviets bulldozed everything else. I don't know.
Just shaped.
Yes, because they wanted people to be able to fish in the lagoon without obstructions. So,
Of networks,
I'm sorry?
of their nets.
Yes, exactly. So, except for maybe foundations underneath the sand at the bottom, there isn't much left, I don't think.
Na, ten ir ledu vaikščiojo, ir plaukėjo toj vietoj, ir kai filmavo, bandė filmuoti, matomumas dėja buvo 0,5 metro. Vanduo buvo toks drumzlinas, kad nieko neįmanoma.
Ten dumblas, mud.
Freundas turėjo
Yes,
planus pastatyti kameras ir kad būtų toks irgi informacinis centras ir tu galėtum važiuoti gal likusias kapines, gal kažkokius pamatus ir taip toliau, taip toliau. Bet vietiniai pasakojo, kad dugną skuto buldozeris. Kapines kai kurias iškraustė žydai į Aleksotą, kai pervežė, bažnyčią iškėlė, o kitą skuto tiesiog galvojo, kad bus pramoninė žvejyba, kad nekadintų tinklais, jo, kad nekenktų tinklam. Bet va, kaip sakė, kada jo sūnėnas, kuris ten nardė filme, atsistodavo ant žemės, galėdavo su kojom pajusti tos nuskutus pamatus. Nes ten nėra gilu iš tikrųjų. Nėra gilu, bet dugnas tas išvalytas gan taip tvarkingai su buldozeriais.
If you, in that movie, they interview a fisherman. Maybe you know him. And he talks about the fact that the fish know more about the town than we do. And I recommend watching the movie, and it's in Lithuanian, most of it, and there's subtitles and things. But
I will add only that there's a movie made about Elliot. Who's the director of that Kaunas company who made the movie?
Rūta Vyzintaitė.
Rūta Vyzintaitė has made a movie about his efforts.
But it's not just about me, it's about other people, including the fishermen.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
And there were interviews in 15 minučių. Aš dar panašiau keliose laikraščiuose, portaluose, apie susitikimų su bendruomenė ir jo planus. Vat iš Lieto ir renka tuos rėmėjus ir supažindina, ruošia.
I can give you the link that you could give to them.
Okay. So maybe let's watch now this episode.
You could make it full screen if you, oh, there you go. Centuries-old market town of Rumšiškių sits northwest of Vilniaus, Lithuania, which was once known as the Jerusalem of the North and was considered the center of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Rumšiškių, like hundreds of similar shtetls or market towns in Eastern Europe, was for centuries occupied by both Christians and Jews. Rumšiškių was forever altered by the Holocaust, which wiped out the 40% of its population that was Jewish. Beginning in 1959, the Soviets built a hydroelectric dam on the Naujasis River, which formed the nearby Kaunas Lagoon, submerging the entire town. the Soviets constructed a new town of Rumšiškių nearby.
Idėja įkurti papildomą Rumšiškių miestelio muziejų, kuriame tikroviškai ir gyvai būtų atkurtas miestelis su visais jo senaisiais gyventojais, yra nuostabi. Tai leistų žmonėms giliau suprasti savo protėvių gyvenimo būdą.
The goals of this project are to build a representation of the pre-war Rumšiškių, showing and academically researching the fullness and vibrancy of life that took place here, where Christians and Jews lived side by side for centuries in struggle and in cooperation. And to add to Lithuania's existing open-air museum near Rumšiškių, which now tells only part of a story that cries out to be told in full. Visitors will go to the existing museum to experience what life was like in rural Lithuania, and they will visit the new nearby museum to experience life in Lithuanian and Eastern European market towns, or shtetls.
Tai galima rasti fantastiškoje senųjų Rumšiškių atstatymo vizijoje. Joje glūdi didžiulės istorinės, švietimo, kultūrinės, turistinės ir ekonominės galimybės. Tai būtų didžiulė dovana Lietuvai ir reikšmingas įnašas į bendrą Rytų Europos kultūrinių ryšių pažinimą bei supratimą.
The end result will be a sight and experience like no other in Europe. One that is culturally and historically true to the real Rumšiškių and to hundreds of other similar Eastern European market towns, in which their inhabitants struggled and sometimes thrived for centuries prior to the atrocities of the mid-20th century, showing the totality of market town life rather than an idealized version of it, showing the rich and sometimes agonizing complexity of Christians and Jews interacting and living lives side by side.
Lietuva anksčiau buvo didžiulis ir gyvybingas žydų gyvenimo, kūrybos ir minties centras, didžiulė žalia šalis su žydų šteltais įsibaršiusi tarp Lietuvos miestų, žydų miestų centrų, ješivų ir turgaviečių. Aš tikiu, tai būtų nuostabi ir stimuliuojanti patirtis pasivaikščioti per laiko mašiną ir pamatyti, kaip šis prarastas krikščionių ir žydų bendras gyvenimas Lietuvoje atrodė iki sunaikinimo. Rumšiškės projektas galėtų puikiausiai atspindėti šį bendrą gyvenimą ir daugiakultūriškumą.
There are spirits here, but there are also stories of a vibrant life that has been lost to history. Stories from which we can learn lessons about how to live together and how to heed warning signs when they flash.
Dar klausimų, something to add or some questions? Ilya was also...
Just not the question, just I was one of the guys who created the Rumšiškių Museum I was a student, and it was a practice in last, it was maybe 1/9 when I finished it. It was 1/60
Yes.
Yes,
Previous
in
millennium.
65, I finished the school, but it was like maybe in 64, yeah. It was a professor, I don't even ask his name, he created a group and we traveled in the villages, Lithuanian villages, and we made drawings and the sizes of the, of course it is a book in the Lithuanian Historical Institute, maybe he printed a book, I remember, with my drawings, with all these materials, and then we just, these buildings which we made like drawings and we created a archive, so they destroyed and brought to the museum.
Yes, we've,
It was one, I have a photo where I
whose idea was it in the first place?
Sorry?
Whose idea was it in the first
No
place?
idea, it's not, I was just a student.
No, I understand, but
No, but it was
who had the first
to
idea?
create this museum, you have to, it's passed a lot of years, a lot of time ago, so I don't remember exactly, because it's not my main object, I just forgot it, but I remember that it was a car, it's like not car, it was like a car like for soldiers, and it was because it was the roads was not so, he knows the places which exactly, for example, he took the buildings from different places, so lakes, so it was because they need all the same, so it was typical houses of villages. Just remember I stole milk from he said, just go and take the milk from all yours. Spoke, all the people, and they spoke with the people, and they said, no, it was 3 students. One friend died this year from Klaipėda, one guy, and another guy is still alive, I think. So it's 3 students.
Interesting that you say that. One of the reasons we decided to build a separate museum rather than build within the existing museum is we got a lot of advice from many people saying there are many regulations that the state museum has to follow that make it very difficult to expand a museum or to do it. For instance, they have a regulation for some reason that they can't build anything new. They can't build a replica. Everything has to be moved, and buildings have to be moved from somewhere else in Lithuania to that museum. Whereas if we build it with private money on a private piece of land, we can build a very high quality, accurate representation or recreation of a building without having to find one somewhere else in Lithuania. And so that's one of the reasons we've opted to not do it in the existing museum, even though the staff of the existing museum is very cooperative and have been very encouraging of us.
It's still, I know a lot of synagogues, for example, Israeli synagogues. They started renovating them, but if to bring them from different places of Lithuania, of course,
It's impossible because there's very few wooden synagogues left.
And they are already nearly in ruins.
Yeah, well, right, and to try to move them is very difficult. We have photographs of the original synagogue in Vilnius. I mean in Rumšiškių. So we'll recreate it. And in a very sensitive way, we will also incorporate modern technology. So, for instance, people will be coming to this museum from all over the world speaking many different languages. And if the interpreters are speaking Lithuanian or Yiddish, most people will not understand. But we will have Wi-Fi and modern technology so that they can hear the translations, and they'll be able to speak with the interpreters and communicate with each other, which you couldn't do without modern technology.
I also
No,
have
one more, I know, it's, now just, my last project, it was in Malete. Malete, you know Malete? Malete.
There's another town.
Yes, and there it was a market, like old market, Jewish market. And they, as a tourist center, like library, the tourist center, exactly the same place where is a market, Jewish market. And they ordered a film, animation film.
Animation.
Virtual reality.
Virtual reality, okay.
And we made a small film, 3 or 5 minutes. It's not film, it's just game. It's a play, a game too. You have to order. On the market, you can buy some products and to create some for eating some. Just to you look at the film and you can put, for example, bread, butter, electric, and okay, it's a game, but this was a film like which we made like renovated the Jewish market in virtual reality film.
That's really
And
cool.
they wrote a project
With people in it too?
sorry?
Are there people in the virtual reality?
Yes. People they buyers and yes. Like, but it's just very simple. They're just making very simple movements. It's not a very expensive project. It was, because they wrote a project and they got money. They told me us and because my mother from Malete. They called me and they have some exhibitions and I made a film about a Jewish film about.
It's an animator
A
too.
film. And it's one of the way to make. Now, for example, I have an idea to make a film about Jewish artists. It's the same. For example, Chaim Sutin or
Samuel Back?
yeah. No, it's a lot of artists, but I'm not concentrating on Chaim Sutin because it's it's the same to put the film in museum. To make him more close to, more interesting, to show the life of the artist. Jewish artist is from Israel, Israeli artist, he was an artist, was a school, drawing school in Israel, in Vilniaus. And Tsar invited everyone without all religions can come to this drawing school first time. And of course, Jewish artists immediately ran to Vilnius. But the idea of the Tsar was to make to educate artists to make icons, Christian
Icons.
icons. But the Jewish people came, 90% were from Chagall and Chaim Sutin and from the last lot of others. Then after a couple of years they moved to Paris and they made the biggest successful life in Paris. But first idea was like to open the school for, of course the exhibition came. It was interesting, this time was very interesting of course. And it's a lot of ideas, a lot of ways to show. And of course, Rumšiškių, I mentioned, you had been in Polina Museum in Warsaw.
Yes, we were there last week.
It's a wonderful museum, I think one of the best museums in which I saw
agree.
in my life.
I agree.
And they made it, this computer.
Another person on our board is a woman named Jill Wexler, who was one of the curators at Poland Museum.
And I think the money gave Jewish people from Poland. The main money came from America.
Yeah,
But they created very close to this museum about scientists museum about Copernicus museum.
Yes, we saw. I didn't go.
The same way. Now we're going. Technology is not.
Phil,
So there is two more questions coming from Phil. Yeah.
first of all, I think the idea of a Turgos Aikšte idea of a market town, market square makes sense. One thing that might be helpful at some level is to explain why, kodel. And beginning in the 13th century, the people who were the rulers here, the dukes and the Schlacht and whatever, they looked to Western Europe and they saw that towns that existed created a lot of greater wealth for the rulers. They didn't have that here. This was largely agriculture, rural, and serfs and peasants. And there was no economic center, so if you had a surplus of linen, of linas, flax, you couldn't do anything with the market. If you had a surplus of grain or whatever, okay. So in January, this city is going to celebrate its 700th birthday. And when Gediminas issued his declaration founding this city, and ironically I think it was he made the announcement from Novogrudok, Nogardukas, but they don't talk about that as part of Lithuanian history. He sent out invitations to the Hanseatic towns. And he said, please, anyone who is a craftsman, if you have any abilities at all, we want you to come and establish towns. And a lot of people were reluctant, particularly after the Crusades and the Black Death or whatever. And they said, we need assurances. And they said, fine, we will give you a charter of rights. And this was similar to the Statute of Boleslav that had been issued by the Polish authorities. And so Jews who were living in Western Europe and subject to being deported or persecuted in other ways were given a charter. Come here, create these towns, these market towns, and we guarantee you autonomy. You can have religious freedom and whatever. And this message could be tied into Vilnius' 700th birthday, whatever, and also to the goal of the Rumšiškių market square. Secondly, although I agree with you that there has not been any place that recreates a shtetl image, there is something in South Africa, and while you were talking, I sent you both an email with a link to that South African thing. The question of the relations between the local populations here, I think is well brought out in a number of the Yisker book articles that are finally being translated into English and in some respects translated into Lithuanian. There's a wonderful tale by a historian named Uriel Katzenellenbogen. And in 1903, he was living in Vilna, and he decided to go out to Žemaitija, to the lowlands, to the west. And his travel took him first to Biržai in the north, and then further west. And along the way, he is with Jews, and he's also in each of these tiny little places. But everybody respects each other. The traveling merchant would see that it's getting late, and he would go to a Lithuanian farmhouse and say, we need to spend the night. And the Lithuanians would say, fine, stay here in the barn, here's some straw and whatever. But they also knew, the Lithuanian Catholics knew, that Orthodox Jews would pray in the morning. And they would invite them to come into their homes and say, we have one room in our house that has no icons, no crosses. There you can daven, you can pray. And there are all of these stories about the way that Jews and Lithuanians got along very well.
What year was this about?
Now, this particular story was about his travel in 1903.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Again, before Lithuanian nationalism and Polish nationalism destroyed Eastern Europe, all the people who lived here, particularly during the Tsarist times, saw themselves as oppressed minorities. When the Russian authorities would go to Lithuanians and say, look, let's stir up a pogrom against the Jews, the Lithuanians said, I don't think so. We are also an oppressed minority in the Russian state. Why should we do this to them?
So that's why the Cossacks did it?
Well, the Cossacks were completely different. They were a law unto themselves. The rumors of the Cossack activities came here through the Yiddish press. People knew what was going on elsewhere. But here in Lithuania, were only maybe 3 or 4 documented pogroms. And one of them in Dusetos resulted in a Jew being killed. A lot of this material is in the Yizkor books. Unfortunately, the Lithuanians have not had much interest in translating this, and the English translations are now coming out. But I give great credit to the Alka Museum in Tel Shay. They, on their own initiative, are translating the entirety of the 505-page Yizkor book. It's the history of our town, not the Jews' town, not the Christian town, of our town. Mm-hmm. And that should be published, I think, by the end of the year. The other thing I wanted to mention was that the first photographers in Lithuania typically were Jews, and so there were ateliers in most of these little towns. So there's been a lot of research done by Lithuanian historians about the development of photography in rural Lithuania, and the photographs that they took of the shtetls and whatever. This could be an element for your museum. The interrelationship was very interesting when you read about the onset of Shabbos. Everybody knew that all economic activity had to stop when Shabbos began. And usually there would be a factory or the local electric plant or whatever that would blow a whistle 20 minutes before Shabbos. And that's when everybody knew the business had to end, no more discussion, people rushed off to get ready for Shabbos. And the second whistle was the time for benchlicht, for lighting the candles. One final note, and I'll shut up after that. I tell my wife, Aldona, I said, do you understand, Litvaks are the Jews who lived on the territory of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. That's not the modern Lithuania alone. Most of it is in Belarus. And I've told my wife repeatedly, if you want to see the way that your grandparents and great-grandparents lived 130 years ago, go over to Belarus. Because very little has changed. I mean, in Minsk, things have changed, in Grodno to some extent. But if you go out to the rural towns, it's very much the same wooden houses that you'll see here in, go towards Rumšiškių or whatever. That's all. Thanks for listening.
No, I want you to be our first hire.
Not for money, because I'd have to pay more income tax.
Even better. Well, thank you.
I'd be happy to help out,
Well, as I said before, we have a budget line for research and the highest quality and most in-depth research we can get. But people like you would be a wonderful resource. And
thanks.
I mean, I know we correspond and we've met a couple of times, but you're on my list.
And we first met when Professor Freund was looking for Matilda Olkadaita's burial site, and he found it. You
Yes,
remember that?
I was there.
Yeah.
Actually, I wasn't there when he found it. I was there
You
later.
were there, yeah.
But yes. Was that when we first met?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so.
Was Sasha about to ask something?
I just wanted to note a personal reflection. It was very heartwarming for me to hear about the project because my father, who is archaeologist, for many years he worked on a similar project on open-air museum in Korostan. It's near Kiev, and it had to be the medieval town of Kiev and Rus. And he was so passionate about it, and so am I. And I really can't wait to visit your place, and I wish you good luck and
Thank you.
many
Do you know, was he involved in that international organization, EXARC?
I'm not sure. He's a local archaeologist, so he didn't interact with any organization from abroad because he doesn't speak that much English.
Well, this is a European, it's headquartered in the Netherlands, I believe. But anyway, it's called EXARC, EXAARC, and I believe it's scientific archaeology, and the museum part is just a sideline, but they look at how to discover how people lived in the using archaeology. It's a really wonderful organization.
Thank you. I will Google.
Okay. And thank you for sharing that.
Thanks.
And I've learned that her father is a celebrity in Ukraine while we were in Warsaw, because we met that woman, young woman, in the canteen where we were having breakfast.
Yes,
you remember?
yes.
Ramona?
And you knew someone in common.
So yes,
Oh.
she comes from Ukraine, and we started talking, and then I mentioned Sasha, and she said, "Oh yes, I know, and we traveled."
Yes,
Everybody.
we were
in
having
Ukraine,
breakfast in this hotel.
Everybody in Ukraine knows your father.
Wow. And I heard them talking about someone who worked at the library, and that was you. Oh, that is so cool.
So that's very interesting. Nice coincidences.
Well,
Okay.
so if anybody knows anybody who has $16 million of spare change, let me know.
Ilya might be one of the sponsors. At least 15 million.
I'll even take one or two.
Pictures and
Yeah, sell pictures. Couple of
you
pictures.
make money.
Okay, thank you, Elliot. So it was
We do say we're like brothers now. I can't say how much I appreciate everything he's done.
now we start to having a sister. Because she was hard working for you.